Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to quite a list of new Patreon subscribers. Lisa, Anastasia, Sarah, Ben, Robin, Lindy, Nisi, Amy, Zachary, Sarah Beth, Brittany, Molly, and Fuzzard T. Buzzball. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener-supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes, full books, and collections found nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, we're dipping back into a Roman classic, The Lives of the 12 Caesars by C. Suetonius Tranquillus, to which are added his lives of the grammarians, rhetoricians, and poets, in a translation by Alexander Thompson, M.D., revised and corrected by T. Forrester, Esquire, A.M., first published in 1909 by George Bell & Sons, London. Tonight, we'll be reading from the life of a Caesar, both famous and infamous. Let's begin. The Lives of the 12 Caesars. Nero, Claudius Caesar. Two celebrated families, the Calvini and Enobarbi, sprung from the race of the Domitici. The Enobarbi derive both their extraction and their cognomen from one Lucius Domitius, of whom we have this tradition. As he was returning out of the country to Rome, he was met by two young men of a most august appearance, who desired him to announce to the Senate and people a victory, of which no certain intelligence had yet reached the city. To prove that they were more than mortals, they stroked his cheeks, and thus changed his hair, which was black, to a bright color resembling that of brass, which mark of distinction descended to his posterity, for they had generally red beards. This family had the honor of 7 consulships, 1 triumph, and 2 censorships, and being admitted into the patrician order, they continued the use of the same cognomen with no other praenomina than those of Gnaeus and Lucius. These, however, they assumed with singular irregularity, 3 persons in succession, sometimes adhering to one of them, and then they were changed alternately, for the first, second, and third of the Enobarbi had the praenomen of Lucius, and again the 3 following successively that of Gnaeus, while those who came after were called by turns, one Lucius and the other Gnaeus. It appears to me proper to give a short account of several of the family, to show that Nero so far degenerated from the noble qualities of his ancestors that he retained only their vices, as if those alone had been transmitted to him by his descent. To begin, therefore, at a remote period, his great-grandfather's grandfather, Cnaeus Domitius, when he was tribune of the people, being offended with the high priests for electing another than himself in the room of his father, obtained the transfer of the right of election from the colleges of the priests to the people. In his consulship, having conquered the Allobroges and the Arverni, he made a progress through the province, mounted upon an elephant, with a body of soldiers attending him in a sort of triumphal pomp. Of this person the orator Licinius Crassus said, "It was no wonder he had a brazen beard, who had a face of iron and a heart of lead." His son, during his praetorship, proposed that Cnaeus Caesar, upon the expiration of his consulship, should be called to account before the Senate for his administration of that office, which was supposed to be contrary both to the omens and the laws. Afterwards, when he was consul himself, he tried to deprive Cnaeus of the command of the army, and having been, by intrigue and cabal, appointed his successor, he was made prisoner at Corsinium in the beginning of the civil war. Being set at liberty, he went to Marseilles, which was then besieged, where, having by his presence animated the people to hold out, he suddenly deserted them, and at last was slain in the battle of Pharsalia. He was a man of little constancy and of a sullen temper. In despair of his fortunes, he had recourse to poison, but was so terrified at the thoughts of death that immediately repenting, he took a purgative to throw it up again, and gave freedom to his physician for having, with great prudence and wisdom, given him only a gentle dose of the poison. When Cnaeus Pompey was consulting with his friends in what manner he should conduct himself towards those who were neuter and took no part in the contest, he was the only one who proposed that they should be treated as enemies. He left a son, who was without doubt the best of the family. By the Pedian law he was condemned, although innocent, amongst others who were concerned in the death of Caesar. Upon this he went over to Brutus and Cassius, his near relations, and after their death not only kept together the fleet, the command of which had been given him some time before, but even increased it. At last, when the party had everywhere been defeated, he voluntarily surrendered it to Mark Antony, considering it as a piece of service for which the latter owed him no small obligations. Of all those who were condemned by the law above mentioned, he was the only man who was restored to his country and filled the highest offices. When the Civil War again broke out, he was appointed lieutenant under the same Antony, and offered the chief command by those who were ashamed of Cleopatra. But not daring, on account of a sudden indisposition with which he was seized, either to accept or refuse it, he went over to Augustus, and died a few days after, not without an aspersion cast upon his memory, for Antony gave out that he was induced to change sides by his impatience to be with his mistress, Servilia Gnaeus. This Cnaeus had a son named Domitius, who was afterwards well known as the nominal purchaser of the family property left by Augustus's will, and no less famous in his youth for his dexterity in chariot driving than he was afterwards for the triumphal ornaments which he obtained in the German war. But he was a man of great arrogance, prodigality, and cruelty. When he was aedile, he obliged Lucius Plancus, the censor, to give him the way, and in his praetorship and consulship he made Roman knights and married women act on the stage. He gave hunts of wild beasts, both in the circus and in all the wards of the city, as also a show of gladiators, but with such barbarity that Augustus, after privately reprimanding him to no purpose, was obliged to restrain him by a public edict. By the elder Antonia he had Nero's father, a man of execrable character in every part of his life. During his attendance upon Caius Caesar in the East, he killed a freedman of his own for refusing to drink as much as he ordered him. Being dismissed for this from Caesar's society, he did not mend his habits. For in a village upon the Appian road, he suddenly drove his chariot on purpose over a poor boy, crushing him to pieces. At Rome, he struck out the eye of a Roman knight in the Forum, only for some free language in a dispute between them. He was likewise so fraudulent that he not only cheated some silversmiths of the price of goods he had bought of them, but during his praetorship defrauded the owners of chariots in the Circensian games of the prizes due to them for their victory. His sister, jeering him for the complaints made by the leaders of the several parties, he agreed to sanction a law that for the future the prizes should be immediately paid. A little before the death of Tiberius, he was prosecuted for treason, adulteries, and incest with his sister Lepida, but escaped in the timely change of affairs and died of a dropsy at Pyrgi, leaving behind him his son, Nero, whom he had by Agrippina, the daughter of Germanicus. Nero was born at Antium, 9 months after the death of Tiberius, upon the 18th of the calends of January, just as the sun rose, so that its beams touched him before they could well reach the earth. While many fearful conjectures in respect to his future fortune were formed by different persons from the circumstances of his nativity, a saying of his father Domitius was regarded as an ill presage, who told his friends who were congratulating him upon the occasion that nothing but what was detestable and pernicious to the public could ever be produced of him and Agrippina. Another manifest prognostic of his future infelicity occurred upon his lustration day, for Caius Caesar being requested by his sister to give the child what name he thought proper, looking at his uncle Claudius, who afterwards, when emperor, adopted Nero, he gave his, and this not seriously, but only in jest, Agrippina treating it with contempt, because Claudius at that time was a mere laughingstock at the palace. He lost his father when he was 3 years old, being left heir to a third part of his estate, of which he never got possession, the whole being seized by his co-heir Gaius. His mother being soon after banished, he lived with his aunt Lepida in a very necessitous condition, under the care of 2 tutors, a dancing master, and a barber. After Claudius came to the empire, he not only recovered his father's estate, but was enriched with the additional inheritance of that of his stepfather, Crispus Passienus. Upon his mother's recall from banishment, he was advanced to such favor through Nero's powerful interest with the emperor that it was reported assassins were employed by Messalina, Claudius's wife, to strangle him, as Britannicus's rival, whilst he was taking his noonday repose. In addition to the story, it was said that they were frightened by a serpent, which crept from under his cushion and ran away. The tale was occasioned by finding on his couch near the pillow the skin of a snake, which by his mother's order he wore for some time upon his right arm, enclosed in a bracelet of gold. This amulet at last he laid aside from aversion to her memory, but he sought for it again in vain in the time of his extremity. When he was yet a mere boy, before he arrived at the age of puberty, during the celebration of the Circensian Games, he performed his part in the Trojan play with a degree of firmness which gained him great applause. In the 11th year of his age, he was adopted by Claudius and placed under the tuition of Aeneas Seneca, who had been made a senator. It is said that Seneca dreamt the night after that he was giving a lesson to Gaius Caesar. Nero soon verified his dream, betraying the cruelty of his disposition in every way he could, for he attempted to persuade his father that his brother Britannicus was nothing but a changeling, because the latter had saluted him, notwithstanding his adoption, by the name of Enobarbus as usual. When his aunt Lepida was brought to trial, he appeared in court as a witness against her to gratify his mother, who persecuted the accused. On his introduction into the forum, at the age of manhood, he gave a largesse to the people and a donative to the soldiers. For the praetorian cohorts, he appointed a solemn procession under arms, and marched at the head of them with a shield in his hand, after which he went to return thanks to his father in the Senate, before Claudius likewise, at the time he was consul, had made a speech for the Bolognese in Latin, and for the Rhodians and people of Ilium in Greek. He had the jurisdiction of prefect of the city for the first time during the Latin festival, during which the most celebrated advocates brought before him, not short and trifling causes as is usual in that case, but trials of importance, notwithstanding they had instructions from Claudius himself to the contrary. Soon afterwards he married Octavia, and exhibited the Circensian Games and hunting of wild beasts in honor of Claudius. He was 17 years of age at the death of that prince, and as soon as that event was made public, he went out to the cohort on guard between the hours of 6 and 7, for the omens were so disastrous that no earlier time of the day was judged proper. On the steps before the palace gate, he was unanimously saluted by the soldiers as their emperor, and then carried in a litter to the camp. Thence, after making a short speech to the troops, into the Senate house, where he continued until the evening. Of all the immense honors which were heaped upon him, refusing none but the title of Father of his country on account of his youth, he began his reign with an ostentation of dutiful regard to the memory of Claudius, whom he buried with the utmost pomp and magnificence, pronouncing the funeral oration himself, and then had him enrolled amongst the gods. He paid likewise the highest honors to the memory of his father Domitius. He left the management of affairs, both public and private, to his mother. The word which he gave the first day of his reign to the tribune on guard was the best of mothers, and afterwards he frequently appeared with her in the streets of Rome in her litter. He settled a colony at Antium, in which he placed the veteran soldiers belonging to the guards, and obliged several of the richest centurions of the first rank to transfer their residence to that place, where he likewise made a noble harbor at a prodigious expense. To establish still further his character, he declared that he designed to govern according to the model of Augustus, and omitted no opportunity of showing his generosity, clemency, and complaisance. The more burdensome taxes he either entirely took off or diminished. The rewards appointed for informers by the Papian law he reduced to a fourth part, and distributed to the people 400 sesterces a man. To the noblest of the senators who were much reduced in their circumstances, he granted annual allowances, in some cases as much as 500,000 sesterces, and to the praetorian cohorts a monthly allowance of corn gratis. When called upon to subscribe the sentence according to custom of a criminal condemned to die, "I wish," said he, "I had never learnt to read and write." He continually saluted people of the several orders by name without a prompter. When the Senate returned him their thanks for his good government, he replied to them, "It will be time enough to do so when I shall have deserved it." He admitted the common people to see him perform his exercises in the Campus Martius. He frequently declaimed in public and recited verses of his own composing, not only at home but in the theater, so much to the joy of all the people that public prayers were appointed to be put up to the gods upon that account, and the verses which had been publicly read were, after being written in gold letters, consecrated to Jupiter Capitolinus. He presented the people with a great number and variety of spectacles, as the juvenile and Circensian games, stage plays, and an exhibition of gladiators. In the juvenile, he even admitted senators and aged matrons to perform parts. In the Circensian games, he assigned the equestrian order seats apart from the rest of the people, and had races performed by chariots drawn each by 4 camels. In the games which he instituted for the eternal duration of the empire, and therefore ordered to be called Maximi, many of the senatorian and equestrian order of both sexes performed. A distinguished Roman knight descended on the stage by a rope mounted on an elephant. A Roman play, likewise composed by Afranius, was brought upon the stage. It was entitled The Fire, and in it the performers were allowed to carry off and to keep to themselves the furniture of the house, which, as the plot of the play required, was burnt down in the theater. Every day during the solemnity, many thousand articles of all descriptions were thrown amongst the people to scramble for, such as fowls of different kinds, tickets for corn, clothes, gold, silver, gems, pearls, pictures, slaves, beasts of burden, wild beasts that had been tamed. At last ships, lots of houses, and lands were offered as prizes in a lottery. These games he beheld from the front of the proscenium. In the show of gladiators, which he exhibited in a wooden amphitheater built within a year in the district of the Campus Martius, he ordered that none should be slain, not even the condemned criminals employed in the combats. He secured 400 senators and 600 Roman knights, amongst whom were some of unbroken fortunes and unblemished reputation, to act as gladiators. From the same orders, he engaged persons to encounter wild beasts, and for various other services in the theater. He presented the public with the representation of a naval fight upon sea water, with huge fishes swimming in it, as also with the Pyrrhic dance performed by certain youths, to each of whom, after the performance was over, he granted the freedom of Rome. Icarus, upon his first attempt to fly, fell on the stage close to the emperor's pavilion and bespattered him with blood, for he very seldom presided in the games, but used to view them reclining on a couch, at first through some narrow apertures, but afterwards with the podium quite open. He was the first who instituted, in imitation of the Greeks, a trial of skill in the 3 several exercises of music, wrestling, and horse racing, to be performed at Rome every 5 years, and which he called Neronia. Upon the dedication of his bath and gymnasium, he furnished the Senate and the Equestrian Order with oil. He appointed as judges of the trial men of consular rank, chosen by lot, who sat with the praetors. At this time he went down into the orchestra amongst the senators, and received the crown for the best performance in Latin prose and verse, for which several persons of the greatest merit contended, but they unanimously yielded to him. The crown for the best performer on the harp being likewise awarded to him by the judges, he devoutly saluted it and ordered it to be carried to the statue of Augustus. In the gymnastic exercises, which he presented in the septa, while they were preparing the great sacrifice of an ox, he shaved his beard for the first time, and putting it up in a casket of gold studded with pearls of great price, consecrated it to Jupiter Capitolinus. He invited the Vestal Virgins to see the wrestlers perform, because at Olympia the priestesses of Ceres are allowed the privilege of witnessing that exhibition. Amongst the spectacles presented by him, the solemn entrance of Tiridates into the city deserves to be mentioned. This personage, who was king of Armenia, he invited to Rome by very liberal promises, but being prevented by unfavorable weather from showing him to the people upon the day fixed by proclamation, he took the first opportunity which occurred, several cohorts being drawn up under arms about the temples in the Forum, while he was seated on a curule chair on the rostra in a triumphal dress amidst the military standards and ensigns. Upon Tiridates advancing towards him, on a stage made shelving for the purpose, he permitted him to throw himself at his feet, but quickly raised him with his right hand and kissed him. The emperor then, at the king's request, took the turban from his head and replaced it by a crown, whilst a person of praetorian rank proclaimed in Latin the words in which the prince addressed the emperor as a suppliant. After this ceremony, the king was conducted to the theater, where, after renewing his obeisance, Nero seated him on his right hand. Being then greeted by universal acclamation with the title of emperor, and sending his laurel crown to the Capitol, Nero shut the temple of the two-faced Janus, as though there now existed no war throughout the Roman Empire. He filled the consulship 4 times, the first for 2 months, the second and last for 6, and the third for 4. The 2 intermediate ones he held successively, but the others after an interval of some years between them. In the administration of justice, he scarcely ever gave his decision on the pleadings before the next day, and then in writing. His manner of hearing cases was not to allow any adjournment, but to dispatch them in order as they stood. When he withdrew to consult his assessors, he did not debate the matter openly with them, but silently and privately reading over their opinions, which they gave separately in writing, he pronounced sentence from the tribunal according to his own view of the case, as if it was the opinion of the majority. For a long time he would not admit the sons of freedmen into the Senate, and those who had been admitted by former princes he excluded from all public offices. To supernumerary candidates he gave command in the legions, to comfort them under the delay of their hopes. The consulship he commonly conferred for 6 months, and one of the 2 consuls dying a little before the 1st of January, he substituted no one in his place, disliking what had been formerly done for Caninius Rebilus on such an occasion, who was consul for 1 day only. He allowed the triumphal honors only to those who were of quaestorian rank and to some of the equestrian order, and bestowed them without regard to military service, and instead of the quaestors, whose office it properly was, he frequently ordered that the addresses, which he sent to the Senate on certain occasions, should be read by the consuls. He devised a new style of building in the city, ordering piazzas to be erected before all houses, both in the streets and detached, to give facilities from their terraces in case of fire, for preventing it from spreading, and these he built at his own expense. He likewise designed to extend the city walls as far as Ostia, and bring the sea from thence by a canal into the old city. Many severe regulations and new orders were made in his time. A sumptuary law was enacted. Public suppers were limited to the sportuli, and victualling houses restrained from selling any dressed victuals, except pulse and herbs, whereas before they sold all kinds of meat. He likewise inflicted punishments on the Christians, a sort of people who held a new and impious superstition. He forbade the revels of the charioteers, who had long assumed a license to stroll about and establish for themselves a kind of prescriptive right to cheat and thieve, making a jest of it. The partisans of the rival theatrical performers were banished, as well as the actors themselves. To prevent forgery, a method was then first invented of having writings bored, run through 3 times with a thread, and then sealed. It was likewise provided that in wills, the 2 first pages, with only the testator's name upon them, should be presented blank to those who were to sign them as witnesses, and that no one who wrote a will for another should insert any legacy for himself. It was likewise ordained that clients should pay their advocates a certain reasonable fee, but nothing for the court, which was to be gratuitous, the charges for it being paid out of the public treasury. That causes, the cognizance of which before belonged to the judges of the exchequer, should be transferred to the forum and the ordinary tribunals, and that all appeals from the judges should be made to the Senate. He never entertained the least ambition or hope of augmenting and extending the frontiers of the empire. On the contrary, he had thoughts of withdrawing the troops from Britain, and was only restrained from so doing by the fear of appearing to detract from the glory of his father. All that he did was to reduce the kingdom of Pontus, which was ceded to him by Polemon, and also the Alps, upon the death of Cottius, into the form of a province. Twice only he undertook any foreign expeditions, one to Alexandria and the other to Achaia. But he abandoned the prosecution of the former on the very day fixed for his departure, by being deterred both by ill omens and the hazard of the voyage. For while he was making the circuit of the temples, having seated himself in that of Vesta, when he attempted to rise, the skirt of his robe stuck fast, and he was instantly seized with such a dimness in the eyes that he could not see a yard before him. In Achaia, he attempted to make a cut through the isthmus, and having made a speech encouraging his praetorians to set about the work, on a signal given by sound of trumpet, he first broke ground with a spade, and carried off a basket full of earth upon his shoulders. He made preparations for an expedition to the pass of the Caspian Mountains, forming a new legion out of his late levies in Italy, of men all 6 feet high, which he called the Phalanx of Alexander the Great. These transactions, in part unexceptionable and in part highly commendable, I have brought into one view, in order to separate them from the scandalous and criminal part of his conduct, of which I shall now give an account. Among the other liberal arts which he was taught in his youth, he was instructed in music, and immediately after his advancement to the empire, he sent for Terpnus, a performer upon the harp, who flourished at that time with the highest reputation. Sitting with him for several days following, as he sang and played after supper until late at night, he began by degrees to practice upon the instrument himself, nor did he omit any of those expedients which artists in music adopt for the preservation and improvement of their voices. He would lie upon his back with a sheet of lead upon his breast, clear his stomach and bowels by vomits and clysters, and forbear the eating of fruits or food prejudicial to the voice. Encouraged by his proficiency, though his voice was naturally neither loud nor clear, he was desirous of appearing upon the stage, frequently repeating amongst his friends a Greek proverb to this effect, that no one had any regard for music which they never heard. Accordingly, he made his first public appearance at Naples, and although the theater quivered with the sudden shock of an earthquake, he did not desist until he had finished the piece of music he had begun. He played and sung in the same place several times and for several days together, taking only now and then a little respite to refresh his voice. Impatient of retirement, it was his custom to go from the bath to the theater, and after dining in the orchestra, amidst a crowded assembly of the people, he promised them in Greek that after he had drank a little, he would give them a tune which would make their ears tingle. Being highly pleased with the songs that were sung in his praise by some Alexandrians belonging to the fleet just arrived at Naples, he sent for more of the like singers from Alexandria. At the same time he chose young men of the equestrian order, and above 5,000 robust young fellows from the common people, on purpose to learn various kinds of applause called bombi, imbrices, and testae, which they were to practice in his favor whenever he performed. They were divided into several parties, and were remarkable for their fine heads of hair, and were extremely well dressed, with rings upon their left hands. The leaders of these bands had salaries of 40,000 sesterces allowed them. At Rome also, being extremely proud of his singing, he ordered the games called Neronia to be celebrated before the time fixed for their return. All now becoming importunate to hear his heavenly voice, he informed them that he would gratify those who desired it at the gardens. But the soldiers then on guard, seconding the voice of the people, he promised to comply with their request immediately and with all his heart. He instantly ordered his name to be entered upon the list of musicians who proposed to contend. and having thrown his lot into the urn among the rest, took his turn and entered, attended by the prefects of the praetorian cohorts bearing his harp. After he had taken his station and made the usual prelude, he commanded Cluvius Rufus, a man of consular rank, to proclaim in the theatre that he intended to sing the story of Niobe. This he accordingly did, and continued it until nearly 10 o'clock, but deferred the disposal of the crown and the remaining part of the solemnity until the next year, that he might have more frequent opportunities of performing. But that being too long, he could not refrain from often appearing as a public performer during the interval. He made no scruple of exhibiting on the stage, even in the spectacles presented to the people by private persons, and was offered by one of the praetors no less than 1,000,000 sesterces for his services. He likewise sang tragedies in a mask, the visors of the heroes and gods, as also of the heroines and goddesses, being formed into a resemblance of his own face and that of any woman he was in love with. Amongst the rest, he sung Canace in labor, Orestes the murderer of his mother, Oedipus blinded, and Hercules mad. In the last tragedy, it is said that a young sentinel, posted at the entrance of the stage, seeing him in a prison dress and bound with fetters as the fable of the play required, ran to his assistance. He had from his childhood an extravagant passion for horses, and his constant talk was of the Circensian races, notwithstanding it was prohibited him. Lamenting once among his fellow pupils the case of a charioteer of the green party, who was dragged round the circus at the tail of his chariot, and being reprimanded by his tutor for it, he pretended that he was talking of Hector. In the beginning of his reign, he used to amuse himself daily with chariots drawn by 4 horses, made of ivory, upon a table. He attended at all the lesser exhibitions in the circus, at first privately, but at last openly, so that nobody ever doubted of his presence on any particular day. Nor did he conceal his desire to have the number of the prizes doubled, so that the races being increased accordingly, the diversion continued until a late hour, the leaders of parties refusing now to bring out their companies for any time less than the whole day. Upon this, he took a fancy for driving the chariot himself, and that even publicly. Having made his first experiment in the gardens, amidst crowds of slaves and other rabble, he at length performed in the view of all the people in the Circus Maximus, whilst one of his freedmen dropped the napkin in the place where the magistrates used to give the signal. Not satisfied with exhibiting various specimens of his skill in those arts at Rome, he went over to Achaia, as has been already said, principally for this purpose. The several cities in which solemn trials of musical skill used to be publicly held had resolved to send him the crowns belonging to those who bore away the prize. These he accepted so graciously that he not only gave the deputies who brought them an immediate audience, but even invited them to his table. Being requested by some of them to sing at supper, and prodigiously applauded, he said, "The Greeks were the only people who have an ear for music, and were the only good judges of him and his attainments." Without delay he commenced his journey, and on his arrival at Cassiope, exhibited his first musical performance before the altar of Jupiter Cassius. He afterwards appeared at the celebration of all public games in Greece, for such as fell in different years he brought within the compass of one, and some he ordered to be celebrated a second time in the same year. At Olympia, likewise, contrary to custom, he appointed a public performance in music, and that he might meet with no interruption in this employment, when he was informed by his freedman Helius that affairs at Rome required his presence, he wrote to him in these words, "Though now all your hopes and wishes are for my speedy return, yet you ought rather to advise and hope that I may come back with a character worthy of Nero." During the time of his musical performance, nobody was allowed to stir out of the theater upon any account, however necessary, insomuch that it is said some women with child were delivered there. Many of the spectators, being quite wearied with hearing and applauding him, because the town gates were shut, slipped privately over the walls, or counterfeiting themselves dead, were carried out for their funeral. With what extreme anxiety he engaged in these contests, with what keen desire to bear away the prize, and with how much awe of the judges is scarcely to be believed. As if his adversaries had been on a level with himself, he would watch them narrowly, defame them privately, and sometimes, upon meeting them, rail at them in very scurrilous language, or bribe them if they were better performers than himself. He always addressed the judges with the most profound reverence before he began, telling them he had done all things that were necessary by way of preparation, but that the issue of the approaching trial was in the hand of fortune, and that they, as wise and skillful men, ought to exclude from their judgment things merely accidental, interpreting the silence and modesty of some of them into sourness and ill nature, and saying that he was suspicious of them. In these contests he adhered so strictly to the rules that he never durst spit nor wipe the sweat from his forehead in any other way than with his sleeve. Having in the performance of a tragedy dropped his scepter and not quickly recovering it, he was in a great fright, lest he should be set aside for the miscarriage, and could not regain his assurance, until an actor who stood by swore he was certain it had not been observed, in the midst of the acclamations and exultations of the people. When the prize was adjudged to him, he always proclaimed it himself, and even entered the lists with the heralds. That no memory or the least monument might remain of any other victor in the sacred Grecian games, he ordered all their statues and pictures to be pulled down, dragged away with hooks, and thrown into the common sewers. He drove the chariot with various numbers of horses, and at the Olympic Games with no fewer than 10, though in a poem of his he had reflected upon Mithridates for that innovation. Being thrown out of his chariot, he was again replaced, but could not retain his seat, and was obliged to give up before he reached the goal, but was crowned notwithstanding. On his departure, he declared the whole province a free country, and conferred upon the judges in the several games the freedom of Rome with large sums of money. All of these favors he proclaimed himself with his own voice from the middle of the stadium during the solemnity of the Isthmian Games. On his return from Greece, arriving at Naples, because he had commenced his career as a public performer in that city, he made his entrance in a chariot drawn by white horses through a breach in the city wall, according to the practice of those who were victorious in the sacred Grecian games. In the same manner he entered Antium, Alba, and Rome. He made his entry into the city riding in the same chariot in which Augustus had triumphed, in a purple tunic and a cloak embroidered with golden stars, having on his head the crown won at Olympia, and in his right hand that which was given him at the Parthian games, the rest being carried in a procession before him, with inscriptions denoting the places where they had been won, from whom, and in what plays or musical performances, whilst a train followed him with loud acclamations, crying out that they were the emperor's attendants and the soldiers of his triumph. Having then caused an arch of the Circus Maximus to be taken down, he passed through the breach, as also through the Velabrum and the Forum, to the Palatine Hill and the Temple of Apollo. Everywhere as he marched along, victims were slain, whilst the streets were strewed with saffron, and birds, chaplets, and sweetmeats scattered abroad. He suspended the sacred crowns in his chamber about his beds, and caused statues of himself to be erected in the attire of a harper, and had his likeness stamped upon the coin in the same dress. After this period he was so far from abating anything of his application to music, that for the preservation of his voice he never addressed the soldiers but by messages, or with some person to deliver his speeches for him when he thought fit to make his appearance amongst them. Nor did he ever do anything either in jest or earnest, without a voice-master standing by him to caution him against overstraining his vocal organs, and to apply a handkerchief to his mouth when he did. He offered his friendship, or avowed open enmity to many, according as they were lavish or sparing in giving him their applause. Petulancy, lewdness, luxury, avarice, and cruelty he practiced at first with reserve and in private, as if prompted to them only by the folly of youth. But even then, the world was of opinion that they were the faults of his nature and not of his age. After it was dark, he used to enter the taverns disguised in a cap or a wig, and ramble about the streets in sport, which was not void of mischief. He used to beat those he met coming home from supper, and if they made any resistance, would wound them and throw them into the common sewer. He broke open and robbed shops, establishing an auction at home for selling his booty. In the scuffles which took place on those occasions, he often ran the hazard of losing his eyes and even his life, being beaten almost to death by a senator for handling his wife indecently. After this adventure, he never again ventured abroad at that time of night, without some tribunes following him at a little distance. In the daytime, he would be carried to the theater incognito in a litter, placing himself upon the upper part of the proscenium, where he not only witnessed the quarrels which arose on account of the performances, but also encouraged them. When they came to blows, and stones and pieces of broken benches began to fly about, he threw them plentifully amongst the people, and once even broke a praetor's head. His vices gaining strength by degrees, he laid aside his jocular amusements and all disguise, breaking out into enormous crimes without the least attempt to conceal them. His revels were prolonged from midday to midnight, while he was frequently refreshed by warm baths, and in the summer-time by such as were cooled with snow. He often supped in public in the Naumachia with the sluices shut, or in the Campus Martius, or the Circus Maximus, being waited upon at table by common prostitutes of the town, and Syrian strumpets and glee girls. As often as he went down the Tiber to Ostia or coasted through the Gulf of Baiae, booths furnished as brothels and eating houses were erected along the shore and river banks, before which stood matrons who, like bawds and hostesses, allured him to land. It was also his custom to invite himself to supper with his friends, at one of which was expended no less than 4 millions of sesterces in chaplets, and at another something more in roses. And with those stories of ego and excess, and before we get to some stuff that I'm simply not going to read out loud on this podcast, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the Nero chapter of The Lives of the 12 Caesars by Suetonius. Nero certainly sounds like he was an interesting person, and I can't help but be struck by just how much men in power like to be applauded. How interesting. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this monumental work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.